The Tudors were one of the most famous and colourful of ruling dynasties in Europe. The lives of Tudor kings and queens were filled with intrigue, drama, conflict, and the best and worst of human behaviour. And so a succession of intriguing Tudor characters has provided modern entertainment in countless books, films, and plays. And, of course, the dynasty has strong roots in Wales. The giveaway is the name, Tudor, or Tudur as it was and still is amongst Welsh speakers. The Tudors of long ago were a landowning family in North Wales, but the leap from being a fairly well-to-do rural Welsh family to the English throne is a mighty one. But that's what happened when Henry Tudor became King Henry VII in 1485. In this video, I want to take a look at how it all came about. It's a story that spans several generations. It includes great ambition, of course, steely determination, luck, and treachery. I'm going to talk about some of the important people in the story, the ones who made the Tudor dynasty happen. I suppose there are lots who could qualify for that description, so to keep the video reasonably concise, I've focused on just 5 key individuals, that is, apart from Henry Tudor, and this is, of course, an entirely subjective opinion. Those key characters are Owen Tudor, King Henry's Welsh grandfather, Catherine of Valois, a French-born queen who became Owen's wife, Henry's uncle Jasper Tudor, and Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother. And I've added to this list Welsh nobleman Sir Rhys ap Thomas, who perhaps could have stopped the Tudors in their tracks and prevented the creation of a Tudor dynasty. But first, let's give some context to the Tudor family. I'll start with a quite distant Tudor ancestor. This was Ednyfed Vychan ap Canwreg. That's about as Welsh a name as you can get. He was a warrior whose life spanned the later 1100s up to the mid-1200s. He served Llywelyn the Great, a king of Gwynedd in North Wales, who in effect became the ruler of all Wales for 45 years. Conflict between the Welsh and the Norman English was constant during Ednyfed's lifetime. In the years after the 1066 Norman conquest, the regime in England was spreading west, and the victors wanted Welsh lands. It resulted in frequent outbreaks of warfare. Ednyfed is said to have slain 3 Norman English knights in battle and delivered their heads to Llywelyn. Then, as the story goes, he was commanded to adopt the 3 helmeted heads as insignia on his coat of arms. The influence of the more powerful English grew steadily, and many Welsh people coexisted as very uncomfortable neighbours. It seems that the Tudor family in general adapted to these times and held on to their lands. They became known as the Tudors of Penmynydd, a Welsh place name that means top of the mountain. In fact, though, it's a rural hamlet in pleasant green lands on the island of Ynys Môn, also known as Anglesey. In the late 1300s, a descendant of Ednyfed, called Meredydd ap Tudur, married Margaret, the daughter of the Lord of Ynys Môn. They had a son, and so, according to the Welsh system of naming children, that boy's name would include his father's. The baby was called Owen ap Meredydd ap Tudur. Many years later, his name would be anglicised to Owen Tudor. Owen, as I would call him here for consistency, was born in about 1400. And so for this video, Owen is the first of the 5 key characters, for it was he who opened the door for the Tudors to the world of royalty. Although the Tudor family had long been comfortably off as landowners. The fortunes of Owen's father and his brothers had been affected by their participation in revolts. First that of Henry Bolingbroke against King Richard II, and then the famous and ultimately unsuccessful revolt by their cousin Owain Glyndwr against the English King Henry IV. Land was confiscated from one branch of the family and given to another. In about 1406, Meredith disappears from history. We hear no more about him. The circumstances of Owen's early life are uncertain. What seems likely is that he was taken under the wing of an English lord and became a squire, that is, a young assistant to a knight. It's also considered probable that he served with the forces of King Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, but again there is no hard proof. 5 years after that famous battle, famous on this side of the English Channel anyway, King Henry V married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French King Charles VI. This bit of politics by marriage gave Henry a future claim to the French throne. But King Henry V died just a few years after his marriage to Catherine, and their infant son became King Henry VI. We know that at this time Owen came to be in the service of the influential Sir Walter Hungerford, a Lancastrian lord who had responsibility for managing the household of the infant king. Owen, a Welsh speaker and who was regarded as a foreigner by the English, had evidently earned the right to be trusted. He was made keeper of the Queen's wardrobe at Windsor Castle. The widowed Catherine was still in her 20s, and a rumoured marriage to an earl was strongly opposed by his enemies. So a special law was passed to ensure that she could not marry without the king's permission, with severe financial consequences for any bridegroom. But there was a catch. As the king was only 6 years old, he wasn't of an age to give consent. So there was no marriage between the Earl and Catherine, but a relationship developed between her and Owen. This was tricky, as there was a yawning chasm between them in social status. She was a dowager ex-queen, and he was, in effect, a commoner. He was a foreigner who even lacked the legal rights of an Englishman. These were evidently two young, intelligent, and attractive people. A writer at the time described Owen as a gentleman of Wales, adorned with wonderful gifts of body and mind. So, perhaps an obvious question is, why would two such socially mismatched people marry at a time when high society would have regarded it as scandalous? The evidence seemed to indicate that this was indeed a love match, and that's something we don't seem to read much about at this time in history. The two married secretly, it is believed, as no documentary evidence exists, and they had several children, perhaps as many as 6. The marriage became common knowledge as the years passed by. 2 of their children were Edmund and Jasper, who were to be very important indeed to the destiny of the Tudors. More about them in a moment. Sadly, the ex-Queen Catherine died young. Without her royal protection, Owen became vulnerable to those who wanted to get rid of him. He was imprisoned for breaking that law which had been designed to stop Catherine from marrying. But when her son, the young King Henry VI, reached the age of majority, he pardoned Owen, who was, of course, his stepfather. King Henry also took under his protection Owen's sons, Edmund and Jasper, his 2 half-brothers. He eventually made them Earls of Richmond and Pembroke, respectively. Owen was probably also knighted at this time, but again, no documentary proof seems to exist. Anyway, the Tudors were doing just fine, but bad times were just around the corner. As the on-off 100 Years' War against France drew to a close, The 32-year-long Wars of the Roses were about to begin. The Tudors were loyal to their kinsman King Henry and the Red Rose of the House of Lancaster against the White Rose of the ambitious Richard, Duke of York. War erupted in a struggle for the English throne. Owen and his son Jasper led a force which confronted the Yorkists at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire in January 1461. They were defeated. Jasper escaped to fight another day, but Owen was captured. He was beheaded in the market square of Hereford. Allegedly, his last words were to the effect that the head that was wont to lie in Catherine's lap will now lie in the executioner's basket. A few years earlier, Owen's son Edmund Tudor had married Margaret Beaufort. He was 24, she was only 12. Margaret was a great-granddaughter of the powerful John of Gaunt, a son of King Edward III. This gave a family claim to the throne. At only 13, Margaret became pregnant. But before her child was born, her husband Edmund Tudor died. It's thought he died of bubonic plague while held in captivity by Yorkists at Carmarthen Castle. On the 28th of January 1457, at Pembroke Castle in West Wales, Margaret bore a son. This was Henry Tudor. From this point on, Margaret and Jasper play crucially important roles. They are key figures in the Tudor family saga. During the very bloody Wars of the Roses, the fortunes of the Lancastrians and Yorkists ebbed and flowed. The throne changed hands more than once. It was pretty complicated. Margaret and her son Henry Tudor lived for some time under Yorkist guardianship at Pembroke. Then the widowed Margaret Beaufort remarried and moved to an estate in England. It is thought that Henry Tudor then lived with his uncle Jasper at Pembroke, with Margaret occasionally visiting her son, but this is uncertain. However, when Yorkist King Edward IV, who had succeeded his father King Richard, regained the throne, Jasper evidently decided that it was time to get young Henry and himself out of the country for safety. The boy was, after all, a person with a claim to the throne, a potential rival to Edward, and so in 1471 they quietly slipped away, quite probably from the Pembrokeshire town of Tenby, and sailed to Brittany, which was at that time an independent state. Then began the years in exile of plotting a return to put Henry Tudor on the throne. Uncle Jasper, as Henry's mentor, had no doubt included his training as a soldier and leader, while he also sought allies and backing for the long-term plan. Just to rewind a little, Lady Margaret, Henry's mother, had married Sir Henry Stafford, who perhaps, oddly in the circumstances, was a Yorkist. He even fought for the Yorkist cause and was killed at the Battle of Barnet. After this Yorkist victory, it has been claimed that Margaret urged Jasper to take Henry abroad for safety, and after they both fled, she was not to see her son for 14 years. But Margaret was nothing if not possessed of a steely determination. She busily laid the groundwork at home, with much plotting and planning, for Henry's eventual return. Historians say that she conspired with Elizabeth Woodville against King Richard III. Yes, yet another king had come onto the scene. He had seized the throne after King Edward IV's death. Elizabeth Woodville had been King Edward IV's queen, and was the mother of the ill-fated princes in the Tower, Edward and Richard, who were presumed murdered by King Richard, an accusation that is still hotly disputed to this day. Margaret and Elizabeth conspired with the Duke of Buckingham, who rebelled against King Richard. The plan was to remove Richard in favour of Henry Tudor, the House of Lancaster's senior claimant to the throne. A detailed plan of action was devised for 1483. There would be multiple simultaneous uprisings in England. Henry and Jasper would sail from Brittany with a fleet of ships. But the plan was to fall apart. One of the local rebellions was sparked too early, giving Richard warning and a time to prepare a response. And a storm prevented Henry's ships from landing. The plot failed, and Buckingham paid with his head. Jasper and Henry returned to Brittany to try again. While there, on Christmas Day in 1483, Henry pledged to marry Elizabeth of York. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of King Henry IV, and the older sister of those mysteriously disappeared princes in the Tower. On the 7th of August 1485, the second invasion took place. It was planned to be not too far from Henry's birthplace of Pembroke, where there would likely be local support for his cause. Henry's fleet reported to have been as many as 55 ships, carrying perhaps up to 4,000 troops, headed for southwest Wales. And this is Millbay in South Pembrokeshire. That's where Henry, his supporters and his mercenary troops landed. It doesn't look like much of a place to bring in ships and offload troops, but perhaps that was the point. It would not have been expected. From here, Henry and his men would have clambered up the rocks behind me, marched inland, gaining support as they went. And this is where the last of my 5 key characters comes into the story. The name of Sir Rhys ap Thomas isn't very well known today, but this was the man who could have, quite possibly, stopped Henry in his tracks. He might have prevented the establishment of a Tudor dynasty, and that would have denied us all that entertainment about Tudor times. Sir Rhys was from a landholding family in southwest Wales, based in the tranquil town of Llandilo. His grandfather had been killed fighting alongside Jasper and Owen Tudor in their defeat in the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. His father had also rebelled against the English, and he took the young Rhys into exile in Burgundy, returning after some years and reclaiming lands. Rhys, by now an adult, did not join the failed rebellion of 1483, and King Richard trusted him. He made him his principal lieutenant in South Wales, that is, his military commander. And so the story goes, Rhys took an oath to the effect that if any opponent of the king should land, it would be over my dead body. It is suspected, though, that he had secretly corresponded with Henry. A Welsh Tudor on the throne would surely have appealed to Rhys. After Henry landed in that rough rocky bay in Pembrokeshire, it was Rhys ap Thomas's job to march and confront him. His force may have been big enough to stop Henry. Folklore has it that the Bishop of St. David's Cathedral released Rhys from his oath. Maybe it's true, who knows. Anyway, Rhys definitely betrayed Richard and joined forces with Henry. They marched separately through Wales, recruiting men along the way, and reunited before that great Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485. One of Rhys's men was stated by a chronicler of the time to have been the one who killed King Richard III. The Tudor dynasty was born on the day of that victory. Henry Tudor, crowned King Henry VII, sat on the throne for 20 years.
He aimed for peace, prosperity, and stability, and worked to restore the country's shattered finances after many years of war.
Henry and his queen, Elizabeth of York, had 7 children, one of whom was another Henry, the future King Henry VIII.
And what happened to those surviving key people who made the great Tudor plan reach its successful conclusion?
Jasper Tudor, after years as his nephew's guardian and mentor, prospered greatly. He regained and obtained various titles and was made Duke of Bedford. Shortly after the Battle of Bosworth, he married Catherine Woodville, the sister of Elizabeth Woodville, who had plotted with Lady Margaret Beaufort. As an aside, Jasper used some of his wealth to pay for an addition to Llandaff Cathedral in Cardiff. The impressive Jasper Tower stands to this day. He also held Cardiff Castle, where there is a stained glass memorial window to him and Katherine. Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was very prominent in court and probably wielded much influence. She undoubtedly advised Henry. He was apparently devoted to her and no doubt valued her opinions. She spent much time with the king and queen. But Margaret outlived her son. When Henry died in 1509, she arranged his funeral and ensured the coronation of the next Tudor king, Henry VIII. And Sir Rhys ap Thomas, he showed great ongoing loyalty to Henry, suppressing several rebellions during his reign. His reward was much land and wealth, and he was showered with titles such as Justiciar of South Wales. Rhys died in 1525. Ironically, perhaps, with this great Tudor supporter, his grandson, Rhys ap Griffith, was involved in an inheritance dispute over his grandfather's lands. He became a nuisance to King Henry, who had him executed in 1531.
Many Welsh people must have been delighted to have a Tudor king on the throne, one of their own at last. And did that Tudor dynasty benefit the ordinary people of Wales? Well, that's a big question, perhaps one for another video. And that's it. I hope you found the video of some interest. By the way, there are separate videos on Owen Tudor, Jasper Tudor, and Rhys ap Thomas on my YouTube channel with more information than I have included here. Thanks for watching.